March 17th, 1943, North Atlantic. Somewhere between Greenland and Ireland, the world was nothing but steel-grey water and screaming wind. Waves climbed higher than houses, smashing over the bows of ships already half drowned in darkness. The cold was a living thing, biting through oilskins, through flesh, through bone. Convoy HX 229 fought its way eastward, 60 merchant ships, each burdened with the weight of Britain's survival. Wheat, oil, ammunition, trucks, fuel, everything an island nation needed to keep breathing in the fourth brutal year of war. Around them, the Royal Navy escorts strained to hold the line, each one a flickering light against an ocean of death. Among them steamed HMS Hesperus, a lean, battle-worn destroyer, her hull streaked with salt and rust. On her bridge stood Lieutenant Commander Donald George Frederick Wyville Macintyre, eyes narrowed against the spray. He had spent weeks in the Atlantic before, chasing shadows, hunting submarines, but tonight the sea felt different, heavy, charged, the kind of night when things happened. Radar screens blinked uselessly in the storm. The sea was a wall of false echoes. Every wave looked like an enemy. Every hiss of static whispered of danger. Beneath that boiling surface, unseen and silent, the hunters of the deep were gathering. The German U-boat Wolfpacks, dozens of sleek steel predators, had been ordered north by Admiral Karl Dönitz himself. His new tactic was simple, ruthless, and devastating. Multiple submarines striking in coordinated waves against the same convoy. Once one U-boat sighted prey, it would summon the pack. The ocean would fill with torpedoes. Ships would vanish into flame and water. This night, the pack was called Raubgraf, the Robber Baron. 13 submarines, 13 captains, each waiting for the signal. At 2300 hours, that signal came. Somewhere far off in the storm, a U-boat commander raised his periscope, caught a glimpse of black hulls rolling through lightning, and transmitted 2 words: Feind gesichtet, enemy sighted. From that moment, the ocean turned hostile. Macintyre felt it before he knew it. The wind carried no difference, the sky no sign, but instinct whispered that the game had changed. He moved through the bridge like a man half listening to a language only he understood. Orders were quiet, sharp. Double the lookouts, keep sonar sweeping. His men obeyed without question. They trusted him. They had to. Out here, one man's calm was worth more than any weapon. By midnight, the first ship was hit. A flash on the horizon, a blinding orange tear in the black. The explosion came seconds later, rolling over the waves like thunder. Someone shouted from the bridge wing, "Starboard ship's been hit!" Macintyre didn't flinch. He already knew. A torpedo, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. One merchantman gone. 50 men, perhaps more, struggling in water colder than ice. He gave no time for grief. Helm hard over. Bring us between the wreck and the convoy. The Hesperus turned, slicing through the chaos. Depth charges readied. Sonar caught a faint contact. Something deep, moving fast. Range 2,000 yards. Closing. Set pattern, 150 feet, Macintyre said. The order echoed through the decks. Seconds later, the destroyer's stern erupted as a line of depth charges tumbled into the dark, vanishing with muffled thuds. Then, silence. A heartbeat later, the sea itself convulsed. A detonation so deep, it seemed to come from the core of the earth. Men on deck were thrown to their knees. For a moment, the Atlantic flashed white. When the water settled, all that remained was a widening slick of oil. One less U-boat in the hunt. But the victory felt hollow. Somewhere in the storm, more were coming. Reports crackled over the radio net. Another ship gone. A third struck. The convoy's formation broke apart, scattered like frightened cattle. Hesperus raced from one mayday to the next, guns blazing, engines screaming. She was a guardian against an enemy that could not be seen. By 2 in the morning, Macintyre realized the truth. The Wolfpack had surrounded them. The convoy was no longer simply being hunted. It was trapped. The destroyer's bridge flickered with dim red light, charts soaked from the storm. Macintyre bent over them, tracing with his finger, calculating. The U-boats would have to surface periodically, to charge batteries, to report to command. Somewhere behind the convoy, out of sight, they would regroup. He straightened slowly, the decision forming like ice in his mind. "We'll not wait to be picked apart," he said. "We'll hunt the hunters." The helmsman looked up, startled. "Sir?" Macintyre's gaze didn't waver. "Come about. Steer for the rear of the convoy. We'll meet them head-on." Outside, the Atlantic roared in defiance. Waves hammered steel. But Hesperus turned into the storm, cutting through black water toward the place where death waited. The convoy behind her vanished into darkness. Ahead, only the enemy remained. The trap had been set, by both sides. Only one would survive the night. Long before that night in the North Atlantic, Donald George Frederick Wyville Macintyre had already learned what it meant to stare into the dark and wait for something that might never come. The art of anti-submarine warfare wasn't about weapons. It was about patience, about silence, about understanding how another man, trapped in a steel tube hundreds of feet below, might think, breathe, and move. Macintyre's life had been shaped by the sea long before war made him its instrument. Born in 1914, he was raised in a Britain that still ruled the waves. He joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman, fascinated less by rank or ceremony than by the machinery of command, the discipline that turned chaos into control. By his early 20s, he was serving aboard destroyers, lean, fast, and fragile ships designed to protect others while forever risking themselves. When the war came in 1939, he was already seasoned. His first years were spent on the edge of disaster, escorting convoys through seas that offered no mercy. He watched merchantmen vanish in seconds, swallowed by torpedoes that left nothing but burning oil and empty life rafts. He learned quickly that the Atlantic was no place for hesitation. Every decision, every hesitation cost lives. But even then, he was different. Where others saw only shadows, he saw patterns. While most destroyer commanders hunted submarines with brute aggression, Macintyre studied them. He collected reports, read intercepted transmissions, memorized the tactics of known U-boat aces. He imagined himself in their place. What would he do? Where would he strike? How would he escape? He understood that the German U-boat campaign was a chess game played across thousands of miles, and the destroyers were not kings or queens. They were knights, moving fast, hitting from unexpected angles. By 1940, Macintyre had earned command of HMS Walker, one of the Royal Navy's veteran destroyers. In that ship, he began to build his legend. Walker's crew remembered him not as loud or boastful, but as methodical. He could stand for hours on the bridge, staring into fog, the cigarette between his fingers burning to ash. Then, suddenly, he'd give an order. Turn 30 degrees, engines to half, sonar sweep again, and moments later, a U-boat would appear where no one had believed it possible. It was as if he could hear through the ocean. In March 1941, Walker and her escort group sank U-99, commanded by the famed Otto Kretschmer, Germany's top U-boat ace. The kill shocked the Kriegsmarine and elevated Macintyre to near-mythic status among Allied sailors. "He doesn't chase submarines," one of his officers said. "He hunts them." That success brought him to the attention of the Admiralty. He was transferred to newer ships, trained new crews, and became one of the architects of evolving anti-submarine doctrine. His approach was radical. Where others relied on rigid convoy patterns, he emphasized deception, unpredictability, and initiative. "Never do what the enemy expects," he told his men, "and never let him know what you expect." By 1943, the Atlantic War had reached its climax. Dönitz had reorganized his fleet into mass Wolfpacks, using encrypted radio networks to coordinate dozens of submarines against single convoys. For a time, it worked. The ocean ran red with fire. Britain teetered on starvation. In response, the Royal Navy began assigning its best hunters to key convoys, commanders who could think independently, who could turn desperation into opportunity. Macintyre, now in command of HMS Hesperus, was one of them. Hesperus was not a new ship. She had seen action off Norway, in the Bay of Biscay, and in Arctic waters. Her paint was chipped, her guns weather-worn, but her crew was seasoned, men who had seen too much and still came back for more. Under Macintyre, they became something more than sailors. They became an organism, each man attuned to the rhythm of his commander's mind. He drilled them endlessly, teaching not just tactics, but intuition. He demanded silence during sonar runs, precision in every movement. "The sea tells you things," he'd say quietly on night watches. "You just have to listen." Those lessons would soon be tested beyond imagination. In February 1943, intelligence reports warned of an enormous concentration of U-boats forming west of Ireland. Dönitz had ordered 3 entire Wolfpacks, Raubgraf, Stürmer and Dränger, to intercept convoys HX 229 and SC 122, both sailing from North America. Nearly 40 submarines converged on the shipping lanes. It would become one of the largest and deadliest engagements of the Atlantic War. Macintyre knew what was coming. And yet, he did not flinch. He studied charts for hours before departure, tracing expected U-boat routes, noting weather fronts, calculating sonar interference from storm waves. He knew radar would be nearly useless in heavy seas. He knew communication between escorts would be fragile at best. But he also knew something else, something the Germans didn't. Storms worked both ways. The U-boats could barely hold periscope depth in those conditions. Their torpedo aim would falter. Their radio transmissions would scatter. If he could exploit that chaos, if he could force them into panic, he might just turn the greatest ambush of the war into their undoing. So when convoy HX 229 sailed from New York, Macintyre's orders were simple: escort, defend, and survive. But in his mind, another mission took shape. He wasn't just going to defend the convoy. He was going to break the Wolfpack. And on that storm-torn night in March 1943, the hunter who had spent years stalking shadows would finally face the pack itself, on their terms, in their waters. Only one side would leave the ocean alive. March 17-18, 1943. The storm did not stop at midnight. It intensified. Wind became blade. Rain lashed the decks in sheets. Visibility shrank to nothing. The world was reduced to the splash of waves and the pale smear of searchlights struggling through spray. Convoy HX 229, fragmented by weather and fear, sailed like a flock of wounded animals. Merchant ships rolled on their keels. Lights bobbed and vanished. Men clung to rails with white knuckles. As darkness folded into a deeper dark, the Wolfpack closed. 13 U-boats, screened across the approaches to the convoy lane, slipped through the same storm that favored the convoy. For the submariners, the gale was a double-edged sword. It hid them from aerial patrols and blurred surface search, but it also made periscopes useless and torpedo tracks unpredictable. In the end, it was the human skill of commanders and the chance of timing that decided moments. Who saw first, who fired first, who survived. At 23 Mo, a burst of static, brief, coded and cold, traversed the Kriegsmarine net. Contact. The message travelled. Within minutes, the ocean itself seemed to reorganize. Steel hulls found new vectors. Diesel engines adjusted pitch. Somewhere ahead, a freighter lost her lamp, then her stern swallowed flame. The first torpedo struck like a verdict. Explosion, then silence, then the lamenting creak of twisting metal. Lifeboats were launched into waves that wanted to take them before they even reached the sea. HMS Hesperus moved like a small, stubborn heart amid the convulsions, constant, precise. Her bridge smelled of oil and wet wool. Charted courses were adjusted by degrees, then by men's instincts. Every sonar ping was a prayer. Every echo could be a mine, a shoal, or the thin heartbeat of a U-boat. The escorts spread thin. Hesperus answered maydays, steamed to flank a burning merchant, then threw a pattern of depth charges into a place the soundman swore at. Each attack was a gamble. Too shallow, and the charges would be wasted. Too deep, and the submarine would slip away. At 0110, sonar registered a contact, intermittent, masked by the storm's background roar. Macintyre ordered the set, 150 feet, pattern 2. The destroyer ran over the coordinates, and the Atlantic obeyed with a violent shudder. Depth charges detonated in succession, lifting plumes that went white in the night like the mouths of some sleeping leviathan. The concussion rolled along Hesperus's hull. Men steadied themselves against bulkheads, as if the ship had coughed. A muffled secondary explosion answered from below, the sign that a hull had failed somewhere in the dark. For a hair of time, victory tasted metallic and cold, but for every U-boat touched, another wolf circled. The Wolfpack's doctrine was attrition: strike fast, withdraw, call others in. Radios crackled with direction reports. Bearings passed along like whispered promises. U-boats shadowed stragglers, stalking isolated freighters that lagged from formation. A merchant that lost power became breakfast. A lifeboat in the swell became evidence of success. Flames lobbed into the night as oil-fed fires consumed cargo and hope. Hesperus fought from one inferno to the next, rescuing survivors when she could, driving off attackers when she could, but always aware that the real war was below the waves. When a surfaced U-boat dared to risk the gale to transmit its sighting, its silhouette was a narrow target against the grey. Some were caught while their crews scrambled to clear the deck. Some dove and escaped into the storm's belly. At one point, a submarine surfaced within close range of a straggler, confident in the cover of night. Hesperus, returning from an escort run, found the gap and closed. The destroyer shut down its radios, throttled engines to avoid the telltale wake, and slipped in like an omen. The U-boat had reckoned without a hunter who thought like a predator. In seconds, the destroyer's guns spat tracer. The submarine burned, crew abandoning ship into a sea that would not forgive. By dawn, the toll was counted in smoke and silence. Several merchantmen lay dead or dying, their wakes stained dark. Survivors huddled in rafts, eyes rimed white with salt. U-boats had scored, this they would not deny, but they had also paid. Hesperus and the escorts had blunted the slaughter more often than not. Where convoys had broken into chaos, they retained a fighting core. The Wolfpack's cohesion showed fissures. Contact reports were delayed. Commanders complained of phantom destroyers appearing impossibly close, and the stream of winds became irregular. Macintyre watched charts by weak dawn light, red lamp reflecting on sodden papers. He catalogued hits, plotted probable U-boat positions where they would surface to report, and calculated where the pack would expect to find easy prey. The night had been a grinding test, machines versus resolve, and Hesperus had emerged not unscathed, but still dangerous. The escorts had paid, and the convoy had suffered. Yet in that grinding darkness, one truth had been proven. A single determined destroyer, commanded without fear and driven by cunning, could turn a hunt into a counter-hunt. The Wolfpack had struck. Now the wolves would be hunted in their turn. By dawn, the storm's fury had not faded. It had only changed shape. The wind came now in great, sweeping gusts that rattled the Hesperus's rigging like chains. The sea was still iron-grey, bruised and heaving, but a thin stripe of light stretched across the horizon. It wasn't calm. It was the pause between heartbeats. Hesperus steamed at 14 knots on a northwesterly course, the convoy falling farther astern with each passing minute. To the men below decks, it felt like retreat. But to Donald Macintyre, standing motionless on the bridge, eyes narrowed against the spray, it was the beginning of the counterattack. He had made his decision in the small hours of morning, after 12 hours of chaos and fire. The Wolfpack had attacked from behind, surfacing to transmit sightings and reload in the shelter of darkness. If he could find that rearguard, if he could strike where they believed themselves safe, he could cripple the entire operation. Macintyre's plan defied textbook convoy defense. His task was to protect the merchants. Instead, he would leave them to hunt their hunters. It was audacious, even reckless. But the convoy had escorts enough to hold position. The only way to break the Wolfpack's rhythm was to take away its coordination, and that meant cutting its voice. At 0500 hours, the first glimmer of radar return lit the screen. Weak, distant, a contact just under 7,000 yards, too slow for a surface ship, too constant for a wave echo. It could be a U-boat, surfaced to recharge. "Bring us around to port full ahead," Macintyre ordered. His voice was quiet, steady, the kind of calm that masked an accelerating pulse. "No lights, no signal lamps. Keep the set tuned, but don't transmit." Hesperus heeled over, bow slicing through the grey water like a blade. The ship's vibration deepened to a low, resonant growl. Through binoculars, the horizon quivered, and there it was, a slender shape in the mist, the outline unmistakable, a U-boat, surfaced and vulnerable. Men moved on its deck, small against the ocean. Every destroyer captain in the Atlantic knew what to do next. Close range, open fire, drive it under, attack with depth charges. But Macintyre didn't. He held back. "Cut speed," he said softly. "Engines to half." The destroyer slowed, bow rising and falling gently with the swell. To the U-boat, it must have looked as though Hesperus hadn't noticed it at all. The Germans, seeing no threat, began to prepare to dive. Macintyre watched through the glass, eyes locked on the conning tower. He waited for the right angle, the right moment. "Engines, full ahead, ramming course." The order cracked across the bridge like thunder. Hesperus surged forward, her hull groaning with acceleration. The sea hissed as her bow sliced through waves. Men braced on deck, sirens wailed. Gunners stood ready, though they knew this fight would end before they could pull a trigger. The U-boat crew finally saw their doom. They scrambled for the hatch, shouts rising through the storm, but it was too late. The destroyer struck with a sickening impact, steel shearing against steel. The sound was neither explosion nor collision. It was the tearing of something that wasn't meant to be torn. For a heartbeat, both ships seemed locked together, trembling as if the ocean itself held its breath. Then came the eruption. The U-boat split apart under Hesperus's weight. Air burst from its compartments in violent bubbles. The sea swallowed it whole, leaving only wreckage and an oil slick that stretched like a wound across the surface. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels alive. Macintyre exhaled slowly. He had rammed before, once, years earlier, in HMS Walker, but each time it felt like wrestling with fate itself. A destroyer was not built for such violence. The risk of damage was immense. But this time, Hesperus held. Her bow was dented, scarred, but she lived. Below decks, the crew cheered. Above, Macintyre said nothing. Victory in his mind was only useful if it taught the enemy fear, and fear spread faster than fire. He knew they couldn't rely on ramming again. The Germans would adapt. They would submerge earlier, move more carefully. He needed a new way to strike, one they wouldn't expect. He gathered his officers in the chart room. "We can't fight them by their rules," he said. "We'll make them fight by ours." His idea was simple, but deadly. The convoy had already scattered. Stragglers were everywhere. lonely merchant ships drifting behind the main group. U-boats, knowing this, would seek them out. Macintyre would make Hesperus look like one of those stragglers. He ordered the ship's running lights dimmed to match a freighter's profile, engines slowed to merchant speed. Radar was used sparingly. The destroyer drifted through the broken swells like a wounded vessel, broadcasting faint propeller rhythms that mimicked a cargo ship's lazy turn. It was bait. Hours passed. The sea seemed to breathe slower, the sky bruised with dawn light. Then came the sound. Sonar picked it up first. A slow, cautious echo, circling at distance, growing bolder. A submarine, surfacing to finish what it thought was an easy kill. Macintyre gave no word until he saw the shadow rise. The periscope broke water within 800 yards, followed by the dark curve of a conning tower. "Target acquired," the gunnery officer whispered. "Open fire," said Macintyre. The first shell struck just abaft the conning tower. The second hit lower. Flames leapt where there should have been water. The U-boat rolled, half submerged, then vanished in a column of boiling steam and oil. When the sea settled again, Hesperus's false lights still glowed dimly in the storm. That night, 2 U-boats went silent. A third sent a desperate transmission. Enemy destroyer disguised as merchant. But by then, the warning came too late. Macintyre had done more than sink submarines. He had infected the pack with doubt. From that point on, every U-boat that surfaced near HX 229 saw ghosts in the dark, merchants that turned to warships, prey that became predators. And in the fog and fury of the North Atlantic, that doubt was deadlier than any torpedo. The third night began like the first, black, bitter, and endless. Yet beneath the surface of that darkness, the balance of power had shifted. The Wolfpack that had begun the assault on convoy HX 229 as a chorus of hunters now whispered in confusion. Signals came scattered, contradictory, full of fear. Some U-boats failed to report at all. Others sent messages that ended mid-sentence, their last words swallowed by the Atlantic. The German command center at Lorient received garbled transmissions. Destroyer disguised, reappearing unexpectedly, attacked while surfacing. Admiral Karl Dönitz, pacing in frustration, ordered his radio men to clarify. But the Atlantic was silent. For the first time, the hunters had lost their rhythm. HMS Hesperus steamed through that same silence like a ghost. Her bow was scarred from the ramming, her engines weary, her crew hollow-eyed from 3 days without rest. Yet the men moved with purpose. They had begun to believe in something larger than survival. They were watching their captain fight a war of intellect and win. Macintyre stood at the bridge window, coat buttoned to the throat, binoculars hanging forgotten around his neck. Spray struck the glass in rhythm with the ship's pulse. Each new gust smelled faintly of oil and burnt metal, the scent of victories that didn't yet feel like triumphs. In the wardroom, the navigator laid out intercepted signal bearings. British intelligence had broken partial Enigma decrypts from the previous day, relayed through HFDF direction finding. The message was clear. One U-boat, U-228, was acting as the communications hub for the entire Wolfpack. It surfaced before dawn each day to transmit coded orders, serving as the nerve center, linking the submarines to Dönitz's command. Destroying that U-boat could cripple the pack completely. Macintyre studied the chart in silence. The estimated position lay northeast of the convoy's route, precisely the area where Hesperus now patrolled. He knew the risk. His ship carried only a few depth charges left. Fuel was running low, and every minute spent away from the convoy left the merchants exposed. Yet the decision formed in him with cold clarity. "Gentlemen," he said at last, "we go hunting once more." He ordered radio silence, radar off. Lights dimmed to a dull red glow. The destroyer would move as shadow, silent, unseen, unpredictable. Every unnecessary sound was forbidden. Even boots were wrapped in rags to dull their echo on steel decks. The crew understood. In the darkened passageways, men whispered as if inside a church. Through the long night, Hesperus swept slowly in wide arcs, sonar pings echoing in the deep like distant bells. Each return was studied, measured, dismissed, or pursued. Most were ghosts, echoes of wreckage or schools of fish. But Macintyre trusted patterns, not luck. He knew U-boats operated by necessity, not whim. Batteries drained. Air grew foul. Even the bravest. Commander had to surface eventually. At 0410 hours, the radar operator called out, voice barely above a whisper. Contact bearing 095, range 5,000 yards, slow moving. Macintyre didn't move. He stared through the bridge glass, into the grey pre-dawn haze. There, barely a shape, more suggestion than form, the silhouette of a submarine, decks glistening with spray, its antenna raised to the night sky. "That's him," Macintyre said quietly. He ordered the destroyer ahead at 15 knots. The distance closed swiftly. The U-boat's crew was oblivious, busy with transmission protocols, their eyes fixed on instruments that would soon betray them. "Range, 2,000 yards, the gunnery officer reported. "Hold fire," Macintyre murmured. "Let her think she's alone." Seconds dragged. Then, when the destroyer's bow crossed the final 1,000 yards, Macintyre gave the order that broke the quiet of the sea. "Open fire." The first salvo tore through the mist like lightning. Tracers arced red and white. The gun crew adjusted elevation, shells whistling low and flat. The second volley struck true. One hit along the conning tower, another into the pressure hull. Flames erupted as compressed air and fuel met in a single, catastrophic flash. The submarine lurched upward, its bow lifting, before it slipped beneath the waves, trailing fire like blood. U-228 was gone. For a moment, the only sound was the hiss of rain on metal. Then a cheer rippled along Hesperus's decks. Low, exhausted, disbelieving. Macintyre allowed himself a single breath of satisfaction. "Signal the convoy," he said at last. "Wolfpack neutralized. Resume escort pattern." But even as he spoke, his mind was already beyond the horizon. The destruction of U-228 was not merely a tactical success, it was psychological. Without its communications hub, the entire Wolfpack dissolved into isolated predators, blind, deaf, and terrified. That day, survivors from merchant ships rescued by Hesperus spoke of seeing U-boats fleeing rather than fighting. Some even surfaced at extreme range to signal distress, believing they were under coordinated pursuit. The myth had begun, the story of the phantom destroyer that appeared from nowhere, striking with impossible precision. German intelligence, weeks later, would note in frustration that several commanders reported engagement with more than one enemy ship where only HMS Hesperus was present. The ocean had become Macintyre's weapon, and his camouflage. By the time the sun broke through the clouds on March 19th, 1943, the Wolfpack Raubgraf was finished. 5 U-boats destroyed, others crippled or scattered. Convoy HX-229, though bloodied, had survived the worst onslaught of the Atlantic War. On the bridge, Macintyre watched the dawn settle over the wreckage-strewn sea. The wind had softened. The waves glittered faintly with oil. He turned his collar up against the cold, and for the first time in days, allowed himself a moment of stillness. He had faced the finest weapon Germany ever built, not with more firepower, but with intellect, discipline, and nerve. And on that frozen March morning, in the grey calm after terror, it was clear. The Wolfpack had met its match. March 20th, 1943. Aftermath, the battle that broke the Wolfpacks. The storm had finally burned itself out. What remained was the quiet aftermath of destruction, the strange, almost reverent silence that follows a battle fought to exhaustion. The sea lay swollen and sluggish under a pale, washed-out sky. Oil slicks drifted in long, dark ribbons, broken here and there by splintered wood, empty lifeboats, and the occasional upturned barrel. The air carried the mingled scents of salt, smoke, and diesel fuel, a scent every sailor of the Atlantic would remember for life. Convoy HX-229 pressed eastward, battered but unbroken. Out of more than 60 merchant ships that had set sail from New York, over 50 still remained. Many bore scars, jagged holes hastily patched with timber, decks blackened from fire, crews hollow-eyed from nights spent waiting for the next torpedo that never came. But they were alive, and they owed that fragile survival to the destroyers that had guarded them through hell, HMS Hesperus, HMS Volunteer, and the few others that had refused to yield. When the sun rose on March 20th, 1943, the Wolfpack Raubgraf was no more. The German submarine command had lost 5 U-boats in 3 days. Several more were damaged or missing, presumed sunk in silence. For the Kriegsmarine, it was a calamity disguised as a skirmish. To Admiral Karl Dönitz, who watched the engagement unfold through intercepted reports, the implications were horrifying. The Atlantic, once his empire of stealth, was changing. His submarines were no longer invisible. The British had found new methods, new instincts. They hunted not by routine, but by intellect. And at the heart of this evolution stood one name, Donald Macintyre. HMS Hesperus limped into the relative calm of mid-ocean, with her bow dented and her hull groaning from stress fractures. The men were too tired to celebrate. They moved like ghosts through the corridors, cleaning guns, tending the wounded, and hauling in survivors, plucked from the wreckage of merchantmen and U-boats alike. Even the rescued Germans were treated with a strange, quiet respect, proof that the battle was over, that death had taken enough. On the bridge, Macintyre stood beside his first officer, a mug of lukewarm tea cradled between gloved hands. His face was drawn, his voice hoarse from days without rest. Yet his eyes retained that same unshakable clarity, the look of a man who had walked to the edge and returned, knowing he would do it again if duty demanded. "Signal, Admiralty," he said quietly. "Convoy through. Heavy losses, but mission complete." The wireless operator nodded and began to type, fingers trembling from cold and fatigue. A few minutes later, the confirmation came back from shore. Acknowledgement received. Commendations pending. Nothing more. No fanfare. No flourish. Just the mechanical brevity of war. The victory was not marked by cheers or bands, but by the slow realization that they had endured. That the Atlantic, vast and merciless, had not taken them this time. In the cramped mess deck, sailors shared what little rum remained, speaking in low voices of the ships they'd seen vanish and the friends they would not see again. Somewhere below, the engines throbbed steadily, a heartbeat of survival. Yet in that muted aftermath, a greater truth began to surface. The destruction of Raubgraf was more than a single triumph. It was a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. For the first time, the Wolfpacks had been met and broken, not by superior numbers or luck, but by superior thought. Macintyre's use of deception, his decision to leave the convoy, to strike at the communication hub, to use the storm as camouflage, had rewritten the unwritten rules of convoy warfare. When the Admiralty analyzed the battle weeks later, they found something unexpected. The German coordination net had collapsed, not because of poor communication, but because of fear. After the loss of U-228, Dönitz's own commanders began to doubt their own tactics. Some refused to surface at night, missing vital transmissions. Others believed they were being tracked by radar, even when they weren't. Panic replaced precision. The hunters' confidence had been shattered. Historians would later call it the psychological turning point of the Atlantic War. After March 1943, the tonnage lost to U-boats began to fall sharply. New technology, long-range radar, high-frequency direction finding, and escort carriers would soon complete the transformation. But the seed of that change was human. It was planted by men like Macintyre, who had learned to think like their enemy and strike at his mind as much as his machinery. By late afternoon, the convoy sailed under a thinning sky. The sun broke through in pale gold rays, glinting off the waves like shards of glass. For the first time in days, the sea looked almost beautiful. A few of the crew gathered at the rail, watching the light shift across the water, their silence heavier than any song. Macintyre stood among them, hands clasped behind his back. He said little. There was nothing left to say. The Atlantic had taken its toll, and victory in that ocean was always measured in degrees of loss. Still, as he looked toward the horizon, toward home, he understood that something had changed. The wolves of the deep had met a new kind of enemy, one that hunted with patience and intellect. The Battle of the Atlantic was far from over, but after March 1943, it would never again belong to the hunters of the deep. And aboard the weather-beaten deck of HMS Hesperus, beneath the tattered white ensign that still fluttered defiantly in the cold wind, the men who had defied the impossible began to believe that the tide of the war might at last be turning. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a single victory, nor with a single convoy's survival. It ended with a transformation, one that began in the mind of a man standing on a destroyer's bridge, listening to the wind and trusting his instinct over doctrine. When the last U-boat of the Raubgraf Wolfpack went silent beneath the waves, Lieutenant Commander Donald Macintyre didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as a survivor of the sea's oldest duel, the hunter and the hunted, circling one another in a world of endless grey. Yet in the months and years that followed, the world would come to understand that what had happened aboard HMS Hesperus in March 1943 had altered the course of naval warfare. Reports filtered back to London, each one carrying the same astonishment. A single destroyer, outnumbered more than 12 to 1, had not only protected her convoy, but dismantled an entire Wolfpack's command structure. Admiralty analysts described it as a masterclass in tactical independence. Historians would later call it the turning of the tide. Within weeks, Dönitz was forced to withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic temporarily, a move unthinkable just months before. The hunter's empire had fractured. Allied convoys, once easy prey, began crossing the ocean with increasing confidence, and from those convoys flowed everything the war in Europe would depend on: fuel, food, ammunition, hope. The long siege of Britain was breaking. Macintyre returned to port quietly, his ship limping but alive. The crew of Hesperus were granted leave in scattered shifts. They disembarked thin, salt-stained and hollow-eyed, their uniforms reeking of oil and smoke, but in their silence lay pride. They had fought through the worst that the Atlantic could conjure, and they had won. For his actions during the defense of convoy HX-229, Macintyre was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and a mention in dispatches. Later, he would receive the Distinguished Service Cross and rise to captain, commanding more destroyers and later entire escort groups. His name became synonymous with U-boat hunting, the measure against which other captains were judged. Yet, for all his accolades, he remained a man of understatement. When interviewed after the war, he simply said, "We were lucky, but luck tends to favor those who think." Those words captured what made him extraordinary. Macintyre's genius was not brute courage, it was perception. He understood the Atlantic as a living thing, a vast, merciless organism whose rhythms could be read and anticipated. He used that understanding to turn the enemy's greatest strength, stealth, into a vulnerability. He fought the Germans not only with depth charges and shells, but with the weapon they least expected: imagination. After the war, Macintyre retired from active service and turned to writing. His books, meticulous, thoughtful, unflinchingly honest, became touchstones for naval historians. U-Boat Killer, published in 1956, was more than a memoir. It was a meditation on leadership, chance, and endurance. He wrote not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen how thin the line between victory and oblivion truly was. He described the sea without romance, cold, capricious, indifferent. But within that indifference, he found purpose. To him, the Atlantic campaign had never been about glory. It was about responsibility. Every convoy that reached its destination meant cities fed, soldiers supplied, families sustained. He fought not for medals, but for continuity, for the quiet triumph of life over loss. In the decades that followed, as technology advanced and sonar replaced instinct, the lessons of Macintyre's command remained etched into naval doctrine. Flexibility, deception, initiative, the belief that even under impossible pressure, thought and courage could still outmaneuver machinery. Those who trained in anti-submarine warfare long after the guns of 1945 had fallen silent still studied his reports, his maneuvers, his timing. The sea keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its legends. And among those legends, etched not in marble, but in memory, stands the story of HMS Hesperus and the night she faced the wolves. Historians would later say that the moment when Macintyre rammed his first U-boat, or when he lured another to its death with deception, was symbolic of a shift in the entire Allied mindset. The war at sea ceased to be one of reaction. It became one of anticipation. The hunted became the hunter. And in that shift lay the quiet turning point of World War II. Because without control of the Atlantic, there could be no D-Day, no liberation, no victory in Europe. Every soldier who stormed the beaches of Normandy in 1944 did so, because ships like Hesperus had first made that passage possible. Macintyre's name might not be as famous as Montgomery's or Patton's, but to those who fought the ocean war, he represented something rarer than glory: mastery. The mastery of fear, of isolation, of the unseen enemy. The mastery of oneself when the world is nothing but wind and water and waiting. He died in 1981, quietly, in peace, a sailor who had seen too much of war to ever speak of it loudly. Yet his legacy remains alive in every navy that sails today, in every destroyer that cuts through rough seas, radar sweeping, sonar singing into the deep. The Wolfpacks never returned. The Atlantic was tamed, not by weapons, but by a mind that refused to be outwitted. And so the story ends where it began, in the cold, merciless expanse of the North Atlantic, where one British destroyer, led by a calm man with sharp eyes and unshakable will, proved that even in the darkest waters, intelligence and courage could still light the way home.